Hi, this is David at TED-IELTS, and today we're going to be learning about punctuation and the IELTS writing test. This is a topic that often fills people with dread and despair, but actually it's not terribly difficult. I'm going to teach you the most important rules for punctuating your essays, reports, and letters, and if you can just learn these, you will be on a track for a much better IELTS writing score. As always, I've divided this video into chapters. If you want to skip forward or backward, then please do so. I'm going to start with the most basic and important stuff, then finish up with the most difficult or least common parts. Anyway, I do recommend that you watch the whole video in order to get the maximum benefit. Also, you can turn on the subtitles if you don't fully understand what I'm saying. Right, let's jump into today's lesson. Before we actually learn about each individual punctuation mark, let's first talk about how important punctuation is. After all, if it wasn't important, it would be a waste of time to learn it, right? In the listening and speaking exams, you don't need to think about it at all. You really don't need to know anything about punctuation to succeed in those parts. As for the reading test, you definitely will benefit from an understanding of punctuation because it can help you to better understand the text in front of you. However, you don't need to punctuate your answers. That just leaves us with the writing section, and here it is quite important. This is one of the reasons why writing is so much more difficult than the other parts of the IELTS exam. In fact, according to research conducted by IELTS, writing scores are significantly lower than those for other parts of the test, and I'm sure this is not surprising to most of you. In my own experience as an IELTS tutor, I've dealt with hundreds of candidates who could easily score band 8 or 9 for reading and listening, maybe a 7.5 for speaking, and then barely get 6.5 for writing. That's because writing includes additional challenges like these. This possibly seems unfair. After all, punctuation is notoriously difficult, and even native speakers seldom know where to place a comma in a sentence. However, you aren't expected to perfectly punctuate your essays and letters. You're just meant to know the basic rules of punctuation, and hopefully, by the end of this video, you will know all of the ones needed to ace the IELTS. Keeping that in mind, let's now look at the different punctuation marks that we use in English. First of all, let's start with absolutely the most important and basic of punctuation marks. It is safe to say that if you cannot use this one correctly, you should not even think about taking the IELTS. This is considered the most fundamental of all punctuation marks because without it, you would not have any sentences. A basic sentence in English will end in a full stop like these. The only time this is not true is if you're asking a question or making a strong or surprising statement, and we'll come back to those later in the video. After a full stop, you must begin a new sentence with a capital letter. We discussed that in last week's video, which you can find up here. It is utterly essential that you do not mix up full stops and commas, as they are not interchangeable. If you put a full stop here, for example, it would be completely incorrect. You would now have a sentence fragment, which is a major grammatical mistake. Essays like this simply aren't going to be given a score of much higher than 5, and with no full stops at all, you'd be looking at a score that's even lower than that. I only talked about full stops briefly because, whilst they are undoubtedly the most important part of punctuation, they're very easy to learn how to use. Commas, on the other hand, are notoriously difficult. Thankfully, as I mentioned before, you don't need to be able to use them perfectly in order to get a band 7 or even a band 9. You just need to know their most common uses. Above all else, you need to know that commas divide clauses. Now, they don't divide all clauses, but there are only a few rules to learn. Firstly, when you have a compound sentence, which is comprised of 2 independent clauses, it could be split by a comma and a coordinating conjunction. Let's see a few examples. In each of these sentences, we have an independent clause, That's a clause that could theoretically function as a complete sentence. This is followed by a comma, followed by a coordinating conjunction, followed by a second independent clause. Now, here's one of the many annoying exceptions that we have in English. When a compound sentence is short enough, we often omit the comma. The next most important rule is that we split complex sentences with a comma, but only when the dependent clause comes first. We have a dependent clause, a comma, and then an independent clause. We can invert the order, but there would be no comma. Annoyingly, many people break this rule. You might see people put a comma before because or although, but this is incorrect and you should not do it in your IELTS essays. To be honest though, a small slip like that would probably not damage your chances of a high score, but it's not a hard rule to remember, and perfect punctuation will please the examiner. Next up, we have introductory and transitional elements. What do I mean by that? Well, often at the start of a sentence we put a word or phrase that introduces what comes next or links the ideas to the previous sentence. We should put a comma after these. Here you can see some examples. As you can see, it often involves time or makes use of a conjunctive adverb like however or for example. You can learn all about conjunctive adverbs in this video up here. Next, we have another important rule. We use commas when making a list. Let's say you wanted to name 3 countries, France, Belgium, and Germany, for example. Well, we would put a comma between each one, and the word "and" would separate the last 2. As long as there are at least 3 items, this rule applies. Now that final comma is called the Oxford comma. I strongly recommend you use it for your essays and everywhere else. Many people don't, but this is illogical. The Oxford comma makes writing much clearer by getting rid of needless ambiguities. I will put a link to it down below. We also use commas to split adjectives when there are 2 of them prior to a noun, like big red car or smelly old couch. I would call this less important than the previous ones because if you omitted the comma, it would still make perfect sense to almost any reader, but still, it's good practice to get it right. There are other comma rules that you can learn, but the ones that I've mentioned here are by far the most important. If you want to learn the others, you can check out the links in the description. Some people feel that semicolons are old-fashioned and that their only purpose nowadays is to make a winking emoji. Others seem to think that they are ridiculously difficult to use. However, they're actually quite useful and not at all difficult to use correctly. Most importantly though, they can make your writing clear and concise. The most common use of a semicolon is in a compound sentence. Whilst I showed you earlier how to make a compound sentence with a comma and a coordinating conjunction, we can also use a semicolon and conjunctive adverb. Don't worry if these words sound confusing. Conjunctive adverbs are words like however and therefore that frequently pop up in academic writing. If you have 2 independent clauses and they have a close and obvious relationship, we can use a semicolon to split them, such as in these examples here. A less common but nonetheless useful way of employing the semicolon is in lists. Earlier I explained that a list needs a comma between each item, but you're not always just making lists of single words. Sometimes those items are long and complicated, and if they already contain commas, we should use the semicolon to divide them. This avoids confusion and helps the reader identify the different parts of the list. Ultimately, it makes your writing easier to understand. So far, we've covered 3 important punctuation marks for IELTS, but there are 2 more that are worth noting: the question mark and the exclamation mark. Question marks end sentences that function as questions. Now, you probably already knew that, but did you know that not all questions are really questions? Sometimes we ask a question as a way of making a statement or raising an idea that we will answer ourselves rather than have someone answer for us. This is called a rhetorical question, and although not generally recommended, they can be useful in certain IELTS essays. An example of a rhetorical question in IELTS is something like this. A sentence like this would highlight the contrast between two ideas and introduce a section that explains the issue raised in the question. It is a fairly advanced technique and could enhance an essay, but in most cases it backfires, and so I would not recommend using them. You might find that question marks are useful in the letters you write for the IELTS general test, because sometimes you will need to ask for information. Although a question mark is not explicitly necessary then, it is certainly useful to know how to use one. Exclamation marks show surprise, anger, or denote someone shouting. They're generally common features of informal written English, so you see them often in novels or social media posts, but not so much in academic writing. As such, you really ought not to use these in your IELTS essays. Still, they could enhance an informal letter where you show the examiner that you understand the appropriate tone needed for communication. Aside from that though, you definitely wouldn't want to put an exclamation mark into a task 1 or task 2 essay for the academic test. It would be quite inappropriate. If you can follow the rules that I've taught you today, you will have a much better chance of succeeding in IELTS writing. But punctuation is difficult for almost everyone, and there are some cases where it is hard to know what you should do. While small errors are nothing to worry about, there are some big errors that you definitely need to avoid. Let's look at 3 common ones. First is the comma splice. This is a really serious error that means somebody has split 2 independent clauses with just a comma. In this example, we can see there are 2 independent clauses with just a comma between them. We can fix this in a number of ways. We could swap the comma for a full stop, add a coordinating conjunction, or put in a semicolon and a conjunctive adverb. Another big mistake is the sentence fragment. Although this is not always a punctuation error, it usually is. Basically, it means having a single dependent clause functioning as a sentence, and oftentimes that is because a comma has been replaced by a full stop. In this example, we can fix the problem simply by inserting a comma, though if it is not a punctuation error, you will need to make an independent clause to append to the dependent one. Finally, we have something called the run-on sentence. This is basically where clauses are joined together with no punctuation. This would be a minor issue if it involved just one missing comma, but when there are multiple commas missing, it becomes much more serious. Think of an essay being like a house. The punctuation marks are the nails that hold it all together. Without punctuation, it won't stay standing for long. Oh, and here's a bonus tip for you. Former IELTS examiner Shelley Cornick wrote in her ebook An Ex-Examiner's Guide to the IELTS Band Descriptors that it is rare for punctuation to have a detrimental effect on a student's score, but when it does, it usually is because the student has tried to add too much punctuation rather than too little. She goes on to observe that sticking a comma where it shouldn't be is worse than forgetting to put one where it should be. People often worry about punctuation because it seems very difficult. But there are 2 things I want you to take away from this lesson. Firstly, writing an essay that is more or less correctly punctuated is easier than you think. And secondly, making a few small errors will probably not lose you any marks. As such, there's no reason to feel overwhelmed by full stops and commas and question marks. Just learn the basics and do your best. If you devote some time to the ideas I have outlined in this video, you'll be well on your way to a great IELTS writing score.